The wind howled through the pine trees like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bitter promise of an early winter storm. Sarah Nelson pressed her back against the rough wooden door, her fingers trembling as they traced the unfamiliar grain of the wood. The cruel laughter still echoed in her ears, growing fainter with each passing moment as the voices of her tormentors disappeared into the mountain wilderness. She had been left here, abandoned like unwanted cargo, at the doorstep of a stranger whose very existence had become the subject of local legend and fear. Her walking stick lay somewhere in the dirt where they had thrown it, along with the small cloth bag containing what few possessions she had managed to salvage from her former life. The humiliation burned in her chest, mixing with the raw terror of finding herself alone and helpless in a place she could not see, could not navigate, could not escape. The thin cotton dress that had seemed adequate in town now felt like paper against the mountain cold, and she pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, knowing it would provide little protection against what was coming. Sarah had heard the stories, whispered in hushed tones around the general store and the church steps. Michael Flores, they called him, though some claim that was not his real name. A man who had retreated so far into the wilderness that he had become more myth than reality. Some said he was dangerous, a killer who had fled civilization to escape justice. Others claimed he was mad, driven to isolation by some terrible trauma that had broken his mind. The children spoke of him in the same breath as monsters and ghosts, a boogeyman who stole away those foolish enough to venture too deep into his domain. But Sarah knew the real reason she had been brought here, dumped like refuse at his door. It was not just cruelty that had motivated Matthew Ramirez and his friends, though cruelty had certainly played its part. It was the twisted logic of small minds that believed they were solving two problems at once. Get rid of the blind woman who had become an inconvenience to the town, and play a vicious prank on the hermit who had dared to reject their society. Let the freak deal with the burden, they had reasoned. Let him discover what they had left for him like some grotesque gift. The irony was not lost on her, even in her current state of terror and despair. She who could not see had been delivered to a man who, according to the stories, refused to be seen. Two outcasts, thrust together by the malice of those who claimed to represent decent society. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The thought came unbidden, a strange echo of the world she had left behind, where people gathered to witness the misfortunes of others as entertainment. The door behind her was solid, unyielding, and she could feel the weight of the silence that pressed against it from the other side. Was he there, this Michael Flores, listening to her breathing, waiting to see what she would do? Or was the cabin empty, leaving her to face the approaching storm alone? She pressed her ear to the wood, straining to hear any sound that might give her a clue. But there was nothing except the whisper of wind through the eaves and the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the peaks. Her fingers found the door handle, cold metal that seemed to burn against her palm. She hesitated, knowing that once she crossed this threshold, there would be no going back. Behind her lay the path down the mountain, treacherous and impossible to navigate in darkness, leading back to a town that had made its position clear. Ahead lay the unknown, a man whose reputation painted him as either savior or destroyer, and she had no way of knowing which until it was too late to choose differently. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, striking her face like tiny hammers. The storm was moving faster than she had hoped, and with it would come the kind of mountain weather that killed the unprepared. She thought of her small room above the bakery, the narrow bed with its thin mattress, and the single window that faced east to catch the morning sun. It had not been much, but it had been hers, earned through long hours of work that her blindness made twice as difficult as it should have been. That life was gone now, destroyed by the same forces that had delivered her to this doorstep. The bakery owner, Janet Davis, had been kind enough in her way, but kindness had limits when faced with the pressure of a community that had decided Sarah Nelson was no longer welcome. The incident at the church social had been the final straw, though Sarah still could not understand what she had done wrong. She had been trying to help, attempting to carry a tray of refreshments to the tables where the congregation gathered, when disaster struck. The details remained fuzzy, lost in the chaos and shouting that had followed. Someone had been hurt, that much was certain. There had been broken glass, spilled food, and the kind of commotion that brought shame to a respectable gathering. In the aftermath, fingers had pointed in her direction, voices had risen in accusation, and the narrative had crystallized around her blindness as the cause of the catastrophe. She was a danger, they said, a liability that the community could no longer afford to harbor. Janet Davis had delivered the news with tears in her eyes, explaining that the town council had made their decision. Sarah would have to go, for the good of everyone involved. There would be a small sum of money enough to secure passage to another town where she might start fresh. It was presented as an act of mercy, a kindness that she should accept with gratitude. But Matthew Ramirez and his friends had other ideas. The money disappeared the night before her scheduled departure, stolen from her room while she slept. In its place, they left their own twisted version of charity. They would provide her transportation, they promised, to a place where she would be someone else's problem. The laughter in their voices should have warned her, but desperation had made her foolish, willing to accept help from any source. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the cabin roof with increasing intensity. Sarah's dress was already soaked through, clinging to her skin like a cold embrace. She could feel the water running down her face, mixing with tears she had not realized she was shedding. The handle turned easily in her grip, and she felt the door swing open on well-oiled hinges. Warmth hit her immediately, the blessed relief of heated air that carried the scent of burning wood, and something else, something that spoke of human habitation and care. She stepped across the threshold, her bare feet finding smooth wooden planks instead of the rough dirt she had expected. The door closed behind her with a soft click, whether by her own hand or some other agency, she could not say. The silence inside the cabin was different from the emptiness she had feared. It was the silence of watchful presence, of someone who had learned to move without sound, but whose very existence changed the quality of the air. She stood motionless, water dripping from her sodden clothes to pool on the floor, and waited for whatever would come next. "You are not what I expected." The voice came from somewhere to her left, low and carefully controlled, with an accent that spoke of education and breeding despite the rustic setting. It was not the voice of a madman or a killer, but neither was it the voice of someone who welcomed unexpected visitors. There was caution in it, and something that might have been resignation. Sarah turned toward the sound, her hands clasped in front of her in an unconscious gesture of supplication. "I am sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not ask to be brought here. They left me at your door like some unwanted package, and I had nowhere else to go." A long pause followed her words, filled with the sound of rain against glass and the subtle shift of fabric that suggested movement. When Michael Flores spoke again, his voice had moved, circling around her like a predator evaluating prey. "They," he repeated, investing the simple word with layers of meaning. "The same they who speak my name in whispers and cross themselves when they think of this place. The same they who sent you here as what, exactly? A test? A punishment? A joke?" The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the full scope of the cruelty that had been visited upon them both. She was not just an unwanted burden foisted upon a stranger. She was a weapon, designed to inflict maximum humiliation on a man who had already suffered enough to drive him into exile. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone, heavy and cold. "All three, I think," she admitted, honesty seeming like the only currency she had left to spend. "Matthew Ramirez and his friends thought it would be amusing to saddle you with the town's blind woman. They called it killing two birds with one stone." Another silence, this one stretching long enough for Sarah to begin cataloging the sounds around her. The fire crackled in what must be a substantial fireplace, its warmth reaching across the room to touch her chilled skin. Water dripped steadily from her clothes, creating a small puddle that she could feel expanding beneath her feet. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the regular tick of a clock, marking time with mechanical precision. "Matthew Ramirez," Michael said, and there was something in the way he pronounced the name that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was not anger exactly, though anger was certainly present. It was the kind of careful, measured tone that spoke of old grievances and long-nursed plans for retribution. "I should have known his hand would be in this." The boy never could resist the opportunity to cause pain, especially when he could do it from a safe distance. Sarah heard footsteps then, measured and deliberate, moving across the wooden floor with the confidence of someone who knew every board and nail in the structure. The sound stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from another human body. She fought the urge to step backward, sensing that any sign of fear or retreat would somehow tip the balance of this encounter in a direction she might not survive. "Look at me," Michael commanded, his voice gentle, but carrying an undertone of steel that brooked no refusal. Sarah lifted her face toward the sound, knowing that her sightless eyes would reveal nothing of what lay behind them, but understanding that this moment was somehow crucial to whatever would happen next. She felt fingers touch her chin, tilting her face slightly upward, and she forced herself to remain still despite every instinct that screamed at her to pull away. The touch was surprisingly gentle, the calloused fingertips of someone accustomed to hard work but capable of restraint. For a long moment, neither of them moved, and Sarah had the strange sensation of being examined, evaluated, judged according to criteria she could not understand. "They told you I was dangerous," Michael said finally, his hand dropping away from her face. It was not a question, and Sarah did not treat it as one. The story she had heard painted him as everything from a murderer to a madman, and while she was beginning to suspect that the truth was more complicated than the rumors suggested, she was not foolish enough to assume she was safe. "They told me many things," she replied carefully, "most of them contradictory. I have learned not to put too much faith in the stories people tell about those they fear." Something that might have been approval flickered in his voice when he spoke again. Wise words from someone so young. "How old are you, Sarah Nelson?" The use of her name startled her, though she realized it should not have. In a town the size of Millfield, everyone knew everyone else's business, and her circumstances had hardly been secret. Still, hearing her name spoken in this place by this man felt like a crossing of some invisible line. 24, she answered, then added, "How did you know my name?" "I make it my business to know what happens in the valley below," Michael replied, and she could hear him moving again, this time toward what sounded like the fireplace, especially when it concerns people like us. People like us? The unwanted, the inconvenient, the ones who serve as convenient scapegoats when the good citizens need someone to blame for their troubles. There was a sharp crack as he added wood to the fire, and the warmth in the room increased noticeably. "You are not the first person Matthew Ramirez has delivered to my doorstep, though you are certainly the first he has abandoned here." The implications of his words hit her like a physical blow. Others had been brought here, but they had not been left. They had been returned, presumably, to whatever fate awaited them in the valley below. The question that burned in her throat was whether they had returned alive, but she found she lacked the courage to ask it directly. "What happened to Bill?" she whispered instead, hoping that her meaning would be clear without forcing her to voice her darkest fears. "That depends on what they had done to earn Ramirez's attention," Michael replied, and his voice had gone cold again. "Some were thieves, sent here with the expectation that I would dispense the kind of justice the law was too squeamish to provide. Others were simply inconvenient, people whose presence in town had become problematic for one reason or another. In every case, they were given a choice." Sarah waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, but he did not continue immediately. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of rain and fire and the steady tick of that distant clock. When he finally spoke again, his voice had moved closer, and she realized he was standing directly in front of her once more. "The choice was simple," he said, each word carefully enunciated. "They could take their chances with me, or they could take their chances with the mountain. Most chose the mountain." The words hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp and gleaming with implied threat. Sarah felt her legs go weak, and she had to lock her knees to keep from collapsing. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt oppressive, the walls closing in around her like a trap. She had escaped the cruelty of the town, only to find herself face to face with something potentially far worse. But even as fear flooded through her system, another part of her mind was working, analyzing the words for their deeper meaning. He had said they chose the mountain, not that he had forced them to choose it. There was a distinction there, subtle but important, that suggested agency rather than compulsion. And he had spoken of justice, not murder, when describing the fates of those who had been brought to him. "And what choice are you offering me?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Michael was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if he had left the room entirely, moving with the silent grace that seemed to be his trademark. But then she heard the soft whisper of fabric as he settled into what must be a chair, the creak of wood adjusting to his weight. When he spoke, his voice came from a lower angle, confirming her guess. "That remains to be seen," he said finally. "You are not like the others they have sent me. They were all guilty of something, whether it was theft or violence or simply the kind of willful stupidity that puts others at risk. But you?" He paused, and she could almost feel his gaze moving over her, taking in her sodden dress, her bare feet, the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances. "What crime have you committed, Sarah Nelson, that warrants exile to my mountain?" The question cut deeper than any physical wound could have. It forced her to confront the reality she had been trying to avoid, the knowledge that her very existence had become a burden too heavy for her community to bear. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down her cheeks to mix with the rainwater that still clung to her skin. "I was born blind," she whispered, the words torn from her throat like pieces of her soul. "That is my only crime. I tried to contribute, tried to earn my place, but everything I touched seemed to turn to disaster. They grew tired of making allowances, tired of the complications my presence created. When the final incident occurred, they decided it was easier to be rid of me than to continue accommodating my limitations." She expected mockery or pity or the kind of dismissive indifference she had grown accustomed to receiving. Instead, she heard the soft sound of Michael rising from his chair, followed by footsteps that approached with careful deliberation. A moment later, she felt something soft and warm being draped around her shoulders, a blanket that smelled of wood smoke and cedar. "Sit," he said, his voice gentler than it had been since her arrival. She felt his hands on her shoulders, guiding her toward what proved to be a chair positioned near the fireplace. The heat felt wonderful against her chilled skin, and she found herself relaxing slightly for the first time since being abandoned at his door. "The incident they blamed you for," Michael said, settling back into his own chair with that same careful grace. "Tell me what really happened." Sarah closed her eyes, though the gesture was meaningless, and let her mind drift back to that terrible evening at the church social. The memory was painful, but she forced herself to examine it with the kind of clinical detachment that might reveal details she had missed in the immediate aftermath. "It was the monthly gathering," she began, her voice steady now that she had something concrete to focus on. "The whole congregation comes together to share a meal and discuss community business. I had been helping in the kitchen, preparing the food and arranging it on serving trays. Janet Davis, the woman I work for, she suggested I could help serve the refreshments. She said it would be good for people to see me contributing, to understand that I was not just a burden." Michael made a soft sound that might have been understanding, or skepticism, or something else entirely. Sarah continued, painting the scene with words as clearly as she could manage. "I was carrying a tray of glasses filled with lemonade, moving carefully between the tables. I had walked that path dozens of times during the preparation, memorizing every obstacle, every chair that might be out of place. But when I reached the center of the room, something went wrong." She paused, reliving that moment of confusion and growing horror. The memory was fragmentary, pieces of sensation and sound that refused to coalesce into a coherent whole. "I felt the tray tip forward, heard the glasses sliding. I tried to compensate, to catch them before they fell, but my movement only made things worse. The glasses went flying, lemonade everywhere, and I heard someone cry out in pain. When I tried to step forward to help, I slipped in the spilled liquid and went down hard, taking another table with me." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Sarah waited for Michael's response, bracing herself for judgment or dismissal. Instead, she heard something unexpected, the soft sound of what might have been laughter, quickly suppressed. Forgive me, Michael said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice now. I am not laughing at your misfortune, but at the predictable response of your former neighbors. Tell me, who was hurt in this catastrophe? Carol Hughes, Sarah replied, confused by his reaction. She was sitting at the table I was approaching when the glasses fell. One of them struck her in the face, cutting her cheek. There was blood, and she was crying, and everyone was shouting at once. Carol Hughes, Michael repeated, and now there was definitely amusement in his tone. The same Carol Hughes who has been spreading rumors about improper relationships between the minister and the organist? The same Carol Hughes who has been systematically poisoning the well of community goodwill for anyone who does not meet her exacting standards of moral purity? Sarah felt her mouth fall open in surprise. She had heard whispers about Carol Hughes, suggestions that the woman had a talent for creating discord and spreading malicious gossip, but she had never connected those rumors to her own situation. You think she was not hurt accidentally, she said, the words coming out as a statement rather than a question. I think, Michael replied carefully, that Carol Hughes is the kind of person who would see an opportunity in any situation, including one where she might claim to be the victim of someone else's incompetence. Tell me, what exactly did you trip over when you fell? The question stopped Sarah cold, forcing her to examine a detail she had never considered important. In the chaos and recrimination that had followed, no one had asked about the mechanics of her fall. It had been assumed that her blindness was explanation enough, that the disaster was simply the inevitable result of allowing someone with her limitations to attempt a task beyond her capabilities. But now, with Michael's question hanging in the air between them, she found herself probing that memory with new attention. She had been moving carefully, her feet finding the familiar path she had practiced earlier in the evening. The floor had been clear, she was certain of that, swept clean in preparation for the gathering. So what had caused her to lose her footing? I do not know, she admitted, frustration creeping into her voice. I was being so careful, moving slowly, keeping my feet on the path I had memorized, but something caught my foot, something that had not been there before. Something or someone, Michael asked, his voice sharp with sudden interest. The suggestion hit her like a thunderbolt, illuminating possibilities she had never considered. In the aftermath of the incident, she had been so consumed with guilt and shame that she had never questioned the circumstances that led to her fall. But now, examining the memory with fresh eyes, she began to see inconsistencies that had been hidden by her own self-recrimination. There were people moving around, she said slowly, working through the implications. The room was crowded, chairs being shifted to accommodate everyone. Someone could have stuck out a foot or moved a chair into my path, and I would never have seen it coming. And in the confusion that followed, who was the loudest voice calling for your removal from the community? Sarah did not need to think about the answer. Carol Hughes had led the charge, her voice rising above all others in condemnation and outrage. She had painted the incident as evidence of the danger Sarah posed to decent people, the inevitable result of the community's misguided charity in allowing a blind woman to remain among them. She orchestrated it, Sarah breathed, the full scope of the manipulation finally becoming clear. She caused the accident, then used it to justify getting rid of me. A reasonable hypothesis, Michael agreed. Carol Hughes has always been skilled at manufacturing crises that serve her purposes. The question is, why did she want you gone badly enough to go to such lengths? It was a question Sarah could not answer, though she suspected the truth was simpler and more petty than any grand conspiracy. Some people, she had learned, needed targets for their malice, convenient scapegoats who could be blamed for all the small frustrations and disappointments of daily life. Her blindness had made her an obvious choice, different enough to be threatening, vulnerable enough to be safely attacked. It does not matter now, she said, though the revelation had lifted a weight from her shoulders she had not even realized she was carrying. The damage is done. I can never go back, even if I wanted to. No, Michael agreed, you cannot. The question is what you intend to do next. It was the same choice he had offered to the others who had been brought to his mountain, though presented in gentler terms. She could attempt to leave, to make her way down the treacherous path in darkness and storm. seeking some other refuge that might or might not exist. Or she could remain, accepting whatever fate awaited her in this isolated cabin, with a man whose true nature remained a mystery. But as she sat in the warmth of his fire, wrapped in his blanket, listening to the storm rage outside, Sarah found herself considering a third option that had not been available to those who came before her. Unlike them, she had committed no crime beyond the accident of her birth. Unlike them, she had skills and knowledge that might prove valuable, even in this remote place. And unlike them, she had nowhere else to go. "I would like to stay," she said, the words coming out in a rush before she could lose her nerve. "If you will have me, I know I am not much use, but I can cook and clean and I learn quickly. I would not be a burden, I promise. I would earn my keep." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity, filled with the sound of her own heartbeat and the whisper of flames in the fireplace. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "You do not know what you are asking," he said. "This is not a temporary refuge, a place to rest until better options present themselves. This mountain is my prison as much as it is my sanctuary. Those who choose to remain here do so permanently, cut off from the world below." Are you prepared for that kind of isolation? Sarah thought of the town that had rejected her, the people who had decided she was too much trouble to tolerate. She thought of Janet Davis, who had wept while delivering the news of her banishment, but had delivered it nonetheless. She thought of the long years of trying to prove her worth to people who had already decided she had none. "What world?" she asked. And for the first time since her arrival, she heard Michael laugh without reservation. "A fair point," he conceded. "Very well, Sarah Nelson. You may stay on a trial basis. We will see how well we suit each other and whether you truly understand what you are choosing. But I warn you, the man you will be living with is not the harmless hermit the stories make him out to be. There are reasons I cannot return to civilization, reasons that go beyond simple preference for solitude." Before Sarah could ask what those reasons might be, the sound of horses reached them through the storm, hoofbeats and voices carrying on the wind. Michael was on his feet instantly, moving with a speed and silence that spoke of long practice. She heard him cross the room, heard the soft whisper of what might have been a weapon being drawn from its resting place. "It seems," he said, his voice gone cold and deadly, "that Matthew Ramirez has decided to check on his handiwork. The question is whether he has come alone or whether he has brought friends to witness the conclusion of his joke." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as the implications hit her. If Matthew and his companions had returned, it could only be to gloat over their success, to see how their cruel prank had played out. They would expect to find her cowering in terror, begging for mercy from the dangerous hermit they had delivered her to. Instead, they would find her warm and dry, treated with more kindness than she had received from anyone in the town below. The horses were closer now, their riders making no attempt at stealth. Voices called out through the storm, rough and mocking, filled with the kind of drunken bravado that made men do stupid and dangerous things. Sarah heard her name shouted, heard crude speculation about what they might find inside the cabin. "Stay here," Michael commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever happens, do not leave this chair until I tell you it is safe." But even as he spoke, Sarah heard the sound that would change everything. The splintering crash of the cabin door being kicked open, followed by the harsh laughter of men who believed they held all the power in the world. The door exploded inward with a violence that shook the entire cabin, splinters of wood flying through the air like deadly projectiles. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the chair, her heart hammering so hard she feared it might burst from her chest. The warmth that had begun to thaw her frozen limbs evaporated instantly, replaced by a terror so complete it seemed to paralyze her very soul. Matthew Ramirez stumbled through the doorway first, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, followed by the sound of at least two other men pushing their way into the cabin. The stench of whiskey and unwashed bodies filled the air, mixing with the cold mountain wind that now poured through the ruined entrance. Their laughter was harsh and grating, the sound of predators who believed they had cornered helpless prey. "Well, well," Matthew's voice slurred with drink and malicious pleasure. "Look what we have here, boys. Our little blind mouse, sitting pretty by the fire, like she owns the place." His footsteps approached, each one deliberate and menacing. Tell me, Sarah, how has your evening been? Has our mountain man been entertaining you properly? Sarah forced herself to remain silent, though every instinct screamed at her to respond, to plead, to try to reason with men who had already proven themselves beyond the reach of human decency. She could feel Michael's presence somewhere in the room, a coiled tension that spoke of barely restrained violence, but she could not pinpoint his location. The knowledge that he was armed provided little comfort when faced with multiple intruders who had clearly come prepared for trouble. Cat got your tongue? This voice belonged to someone else, younger and higher pitched. Kevin Rivera, she realized, Matthew's cousin and frequent companion in cruelty. Or maybe the hermit cut it out for you. They say he does things like that to people who talk too much. The third voice, when it came, was deeper and more cautious than the others. Maybe we should just grab her and go, Matt. This place gives me the creeps, and if half the stories about Flores are true, we're asking for trouble staying here. Shut up, Alan, Matthew snapped, his good humor evaporating. The stories are just that, stories. Old women's tales to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. There's nothing up here but a crazy hermit who's probably cowering in some corner, pissing himself at the sight of real men. Sarah heard him moving closer, his boots scraping against the wooden floor with each step. The smell of alcohol grew stronger, mixed with something else that made her stomach turn. It was the scent of violence, of men who had worked themselves into a state where brutality seemed not just acceptable, but necessary. Besides, Matthew continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow managed to be more terrifying than his earlier shouting, we came all this way to see how our little joke played out. It would be rude not to stay and enjoy the show. The silence that followed was broken by a sound that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. It was soft, almost gentle, but unmistakably the whisper of steel being drawn from leather. Michael had moved, positioning himself somewhere behind the intruders, and the weapon he had retrieved was now ready for use. Gentlemen, Michael's voice came from the shadows, calm and measured despite the circumstances. You are trespassing on private property. I suggest you collect your friend and leave before this situation becomes more complicated than any of you are prepared to handle. The effect of his words on the three intruders was immediate and dramatic. Matthew spun around, his hand going instinctively to his own weapon, while his companion stepped backward toward the ruined door. But instead of the fear Sarah had expected, she heard something far more dangerous in Matthew's voice when he responded. There he is, Matthew said, and there was triumph in his tone. The great Michael Flores, finally showing his face. Tell me, hermit, how do you like the gift we brought you? She's not much to look at, but I hear blind women are grateful for any attention they receive. The crude laughter that followed his words was cut short by a sound that made the hair on Sarah's neck stand on end. It was soft, barely audible, but it carried with it the promise of swift and terrible retribution. Michael had moved again, and she could sense him closing the distance between himself and the intruders with the silent grace of a hunting cat. Your business here is concluded, Michael said, his voice now coming from a different location entirely. The woman stays. You leave. Now. I don't think so, Matthew replied, though Sarah could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. See, we've got unfinished business with little Sarah here. She caused quite a stir back in town, and there are people who think she needs to be taught a lesson about the consequences of her actions. Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows, each one designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. The revelation that her exile had been orchestrated, that Carol Hughes had manipulated events to ensure her removal, had provided some measure of relief from the crushing guilt she had carried. But now Matthew was suggesting that even that small comfort had been illusory, that she truly was responsible for the chaos that had destroyed her life. What consequences? Michael's voice had gone deadly quiet, the kind of stillness that preceded explosive violence. What exactly do you believe she has done that warrants your attention? She nearly killed Carol Hughes, Kevin interjected, his voice shrill with manufactured outrage. Cut her face open with a glass, left a scar that'll mark her for life. And that's not even counting all the other trouble she's caused over the years, stumbling around where she doesn't belong, making everyone else responsible for her safety. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, to explain what she now suspected about the true nature of that incident, but Michael's voice cut through the air before she could speak. "Interesting," he said, and there was something in his tone that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "And I suppose you witnessed this alleged assault personally? You saw Sarah Nelson deliberately attack an innocent woman?" The silence that followed was telling. Sarah could hear the shuffle of feet, the whispered conference between the three men as they realized they had stepped into deeper water than they had intended. When Matthew finally responded, his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "We don't need to have seen it," he said, but the words came out defensive rather than accusatory. "Everyone knows what happened. The whole town was talking about it." "Everyone knows," Michael repeated, investing the words with layers of skepticism. "The same everyone who knows that I'm a dangerous killer who preys on innocent travelers? The same everyone who spreads stories without bothering to verify their truth? Tell me, Matthew Ramirez, what do you actually know about the incident you're describing?" Sarah could hear the trap being set, the careful way Michael was maneuvering the conversation toward a point that would expose the weakness of their position. She found herself holding her breath, waiting to see how the three men would respond to this challenge to their assumed authority. "Look, we didn't come here to debate the details," Alan said, his voice tight with growing anxiety. "We came to collect what belongs to the town and take it back where it belongs. Sarah Nelson is a ward of the community, and the community has decided she needs to face justice for her actions." "A ward of the community," Michael said, and now there was genuine amusement in his voice. "How fascinating. And when did the town of Millfield acquire the legal authority to declare someone a ward against their will? When did you become empowered to serve as agents of this community justice?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, each one designed to highlight the fundamental illegality of what the three men were attempting. Sarah realized that Michael was not just defending her, he was systematically dismantling the justifications they had constructed for their actions. "We don't need legal authority," Matthew snarled, his patience finally exhausted. "We have the authority that comes from being decent people dealing with a problem that threatens our families and our way of life. Sarah Nelson is a danger to everyone around her, and if the law won't deal with her, then we will." "Ah," Michael said, and Sarah could hear him moving again, repositioning himself with the fluid grace that seemed to be his trademark. "Now we come to the truth of the matter. You have appointed yourselves judge, jury, and executioner, dispensing vigilante justice according to your own prejudices and fears. Tell me, what sentence have you decided to impose on this dangerous criminal?" The question was met with another uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of rain drumming against the cabin roof and the whisper of wind through the destroyed door. Sarah realized that the three men had not thought beyond the immediate gratification of their cruelty, had not considered what they would actually do with her once they had her in their power. "That's not your concern," Kevin finally said, his voice cracking with adolescent bravado. "Just hand her over and we'll be on our way. No one needs to get hurt here." "No one needs to get hurt," Michael agreed, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have. "But someone is going to get hurt if you don't leave my property immediately. The question is whether it will be you or whether it will be me." The threat was delivered with such casual certainty that Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This was not the voice of a man making empty boasts or trying to intimidate through bluster. This was the voice of someone who had killed before, who would kill again if circumstances required it, and who felt no particular emotion about the prospect either way. "You're outnumbered 3-1, Matthew said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, the first real crack in his confidence. "And we're armed. You sure you want to play those odds, old man?" "I'm sure," Michael replied without hesitation. "The question is whether you are, because I should mention that I know exactly who you are, Matthew Ramirez. I know where you live, where you work, where your mother takes her laundry every Tuesday morning. I know about the money you've been stealing from the church collection plate, and I know about the girl in Riverside who's carrying your child while you court the banker's daughter back in town." The effect of these revelations was immediate and devastating. Sarah heard Matthew's sharp intake of breath, heard the shuffle of feet as his companions stepped away from him, suddenly uncertain about their leader's moral authority. The casual way Michael delivered these personal details made it clear that his knowledge extended far beyond simple observation, that he had access to information that could destroy reputations and ruin lives. "You're lying," Matthew said, but the words came out hollow and unconvincing. "You're just trying to scare us with made-up stories." "Am I?" Michael asked, and Sarah could hear the smile in his voice. "Would you like me to continue? I could tell your friends about the arrangement that you have with the cattle rustlers who've been working the valley, or about the way you've been watering down the whiskey at your family's store and selling it at full-strength prices. I have quite a collection of interesting facts about the good citizens of Millfield." The silence that followed was broken by Alan's voice, tight with barely controlled panic. "Matt, maybe we should just go. This isn't worth it. The girl's not worth dying over." "Nobody's dying," Matthew snapped, but Sarah could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. "He's just one man, and he's trying to bluff us into backing down. We stick to the plan." "What plan?" Kevin asked, his voice rising to a near squeak. "You said we were just going to grab her and go. You didn't say anything about getting into a fight with a killer." "He's not a killer, Joe," Matthew insisted, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as his companions. "He's just a crazy hermit who's been alone too long. All we have to do is call his bluff and he'll fold like a house of cards." Sarah heard the soft whisper of movement, the almost inaudible sound of someone shifting position with practiced stealth. Michael was repositioning himself again, and she had the distinct impression that he was closing in on the three intruders like a wolf circling wounded prey. "Gentlemen," Michael's voice came from yet another location, confirming her suspicions about his movement. "I'm going to give you one final opportunity to leave this cabin with all your limbs intact. I suggest you take it. And I'm going to give you one final opportunity to hand over the girl," Matthew replied, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "We didn't ride all the way up here in a storm just to go home empty-handed." The standoff stretched for long seconds, filled with the sound of heavy breathing and the creak of floorboards under shifting weight. Sarah could feel the tension building like pressure in a boiler, ready to explode into violence at the slightest provocation. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles ached, and she found herself praying to a God she was no longer sure was listening. The explosion, when it came, was not the gunfire she had been expecting. Instead, it was the sound of splintering wood and startled cries as something heavy crashed through the cabin wall near the fireplace. Sarah felt debris shower down around her, heard the hiss of steam as rain struck the hot stones of the hearth. "What the hell was that?" Kevin shouted, his voice high with terror. "Tree branch," Alan replied, his words barely audible over the howling wind that now poured through the new opening. "The storm's getting worse. We need to get out of here before the whole mountain comes down on us." But Matthew was beyond reason now, driven by a combination of alcohol, wounded pride, and the kind of desperate fury that made men do incredibly stupid things. "We're not leaving without her," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I don't care if this whole place falls down around us. She's coming with us, and that's final." Sarah heard the metallic click of a gun being cocked, followed by the sound of boots moving across the floor with grim purpose. Matthew was approaching her chair, his weapon drawn and his intentions clear. She pressed herself back into the cushions, knowing that there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from what was coming. "Get up," Matthew commanded, his voice deadly serious now. "Get up and come with us, or I'll put a bullet in you right here and tell everyone you tried to attack me." Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the arms of the chair, her mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same terrible conclusion. She could comply and hope that whatever they had planned for her would be quick, or she could resist and face immediate death. Neither choice offered any real hope of survival. "She's not going anywhere with you." Michael's voice came from directly behind Matthew, so close that Sarah could hear the sharp intake of breath from all three intruders. Somehow, despite the chaos and confusion, he had managed to position himself within striking distance of their leader without being detected. "Drop the weapon," Michael continued, his voice calm and conversational despite the circumstances. "Drop it now, or I'll open your throat from ear to ear." Sarah heard the distinctive sound of steel against skin, the whisper of a blade being pressed against flesh, with just enough pressure to draw blood. Matthew's breathing became rapid and shallow, the harsh panting of a man who had suddenly realized that he was no longer the predator in this situation. "You're bluffing," Matthew said, but his voice was barely a whisper now, all the bravado drained out of him. "You wouldn't dare." "Wouldn't I?" Michael asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his tone. "What exactly do you think is stopping me? The law? The same law that allowed you to kidnap a helpless woman and abandon her in a storm? Social convention? The same social convention that permits you to terrorize someone for the crime of being born different?" The blade pressed deeper, and Sarah heard Matthew's sharp gasp of pain. A drop of something warm and wet splashed onto the floor near her feet, and she realized it was blood. "I have killed men for far less than what you have done tonight," Michael continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "I have ended lives for the simple crime of threatening people under my protection. What makes you think you deserve better treatment?" The cabin fell silent except for the storm raging outside and Matthew's labored breathing. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment, the terrible balance between life and death that hung on Michael's decision. She found herself holding her breath, waiting to see whether the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness would prove to be the killer the stories claimed he was. "Please," Matthew whispered, the word torn from his throat like a confession. "Please don't kill me. I have a family, people who depend on me." "The same family you were thinking of when you decided to terrorize a blind woman?" Michael asked, his voice still maddeningly calm. "The same people you were protecting when you broke into my home and threatened someone under my roof?" Sarah heard the soft sound of movement, the whisper of fabric against wood, as Kevin and Alan edged toward the ruined door. They were abandoning their leader, she realized, choosing their own survival over whatever loyalty they might have felt for Matthew Ramirez. "Don't move," Michael commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "Either of you take another step and your friend here dies. We're going to settle this properly, all of us together." The movement stopped immediately, followed by the sound of two men trying very hard not to breathe too loudly. Sarah could feel the terror radiating from them like heat from a fire, the knowledge that they had stumbled into a situation far beyond their ability to control or escape. "Now, Michael continued, his attention returning to Matthew. "You're going to explain to me exactly why you thought it was acceptable to dump this woman at my door like a piece of unwanted cargo. And you're going to tell me the truth, not the convenient fiction you've been peddling about community justice and public safety." "It was just a joke," Matthew gasped, the words tumbling out in a rush. "We thought it would be funny, you know? The blind girl and the crazy hermit stuck together on the mountain. We didn't think you'd actually hurt her. We thought you'd just send her back down. Maybe teach her a lesson about staying where she belongs." "A joke," Michael repeated, investing the word with infinite contempt. "You terrorized a helpless woman, destroyed her life, and delivered her to what you believed was certain death, all for the sake of a joke. Is that what you're telling me?" "She's not helpless," Kevin interjected, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's dangerous. She hurt Carol Hughes, could have killed her if she'd been unlucky. The whole town knows she's a menace." "The whole town knows," Michael said, and Sarah could hear him shifting positions slightly, maintaining his grip on Matthew while turning his attention to the other speaker. "Tell me, Kevin Rivera, were you present when this alleged attack occurred? Did you witness Sarah Nelson deliberately assault Carol Hughes?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Sarah realized that none of these men had actually seen what happened at the church social, that they were operating entirely on secondhand information and community gossip. "I thought not," Michael continued. "So you participated in the kidnapping and abandonment of an innocent woman based on stories you heard from others, without bothering to verify the facts or consider the consequences of your actions. Is that correct?" "We were protecting the community," Alan said, his voice barely audible. "Someone had to do something before she hurt someone else." "Protecting the community," Michael repeated, And now there was genuine anger in his voice for the first time since the confrontation began. By committing crimes that would earn you years in prison if the law ever caught up with you. By terrorizing someone whose only offense was being born different from yourselves. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks, though she could not have said whether they were tears of fear, relief, or simple gratitude for finally hearing someone defend her against the accusations that had destroyed her life. For months, she had carried the weight of believing herself responsible for the chaos at the church social, accepting the community's judgment that she was a danger to others. "You want to know what really happened that night?" Michael asked, his voice cutting through her emotional turmoil. "You want to know why Sarah Nelson fell and spilled those glasses?" "We know what happened," Matthew said, though his voice lacked conviction. "She was clumsy, couldn't see where she was going, knocked into things like she always does." "She was sabotaged," Michael said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. Someone deliberately placed an obstacle in her path, knowing she would be unable to see it. Someone who wanted to create exactly the kind of incident that would justify removing her from the community. The revelation hit the three men like a physical blow. Sarah heard their sharp intakes of breath, heard the shuffle of feet as they processed the implications of what Michael was suggesting. "That's impossible," Kevin said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Who would do something like that? "Someone who had been looking for an excuse to get rid of Sarah Nelson," Michael replied. "Someone who saw an opportunity to eliminate what they perceived as a burden on the community while making it look like an accident. Someone who had the social standing to make their version of events the accepted truth." Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place in her own mind, the pattern of manipulation and cruelty that had led to her exile becoming clear for the first time. Carol Hughes had not just taken advantage of an accident to attack her, she had created the accident in the first place. "Carol Hughes," she whispered, the name escaping her lips before she could stop herself. "Carol Hughes," Michael confirmed, his voice heavy with disgust. "A woman who has made a career of destroying the lives of people she considers beneath her notice. A woman who saw Sarah Nelson as an inconvenience to be eliminated, and who was clever enough to make her removal look like a community necessity rather than personal vindictiveness." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the storm intensifying outside, wind howling through the mountains with renewed fury. Sarah could hear trees creaking and groaning under the assault, could feel the cabin shaking as gusts struck it with increasing violence. "This is all very interesting," Matthew said, his voice strained but still defiant. "But it doesn't change anything. Even if Carol Hughes did set up the accident, Sarah is still dangerous. She still doesn't belong in civilized society." The blade pressed deeper into his throat, and Sarah heard his sharp gasp of pain. When Michael spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. "Civilized society," he repeated. "Is that what you call a place where innocent people can be framed for crimes they didn't commit? Where the weak and vulnerable can be terrorized and exiled for the entertainment of their betters? Where vigilante justice is considered acceptable as long as the victims are sufficiently powerless to fight back?" Sarah heard the sound of metal against metal, the distinctive click of a gun being cocked. But this time the sound came from behind Michael, and she realized with growing horror that one of the other men had drawn his weapon and was preparing to use it. "Let him go." Alan's voice was shaking but determined. "Let him go or I'll put a bullet in your back." The tableau froze, four people locked in a deadly balance where any movement could trigger an explosion of violence. Sarah could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a lightning strike, could sense the terrible calculation taking place as each person weighed their options and considered the consequences of action or inaction. "You don't want to do that," Michael said, his voice still calm despite the gun pointed at his spine. "Pull that trigger and you'll be a murderer, wanted by every law enforcement agency in the territory. Is Matthew Ramirez worth spending the rest of your life running from the law?" "He's my friend," Alan replied, though Sarah could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I'm not going to let you cut his throat like a pig." "Your friend," Michael said, and there was bitter amusement in his tone. The same friend who got you into this situation by convincing you to participate in kidnapping and abandonment. The same friend who's been stealing from his own family's business and cheating on his fiancée. Tell me, Alan Rivera, what exactly has Matthew Ramirez done to earn such loyalty? The question hung in the air, exposing the fundamental weakness in their alliance. Sarah realized that these men were not bound together by genuine friendship or shared principles, but by convenience and the kind of pack mentality that made cowards feel brave when they acted in groups. It doesn't matter, Alan said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm not going to stand here and watch you murder him. Murder, Michael repeated thoughtfully. An interesting choice of words from someone who participated in what amounts to attempted murder by exposure. Tell me, what did you think would happen to Sarah Nelson when you left her at my door in the middle of a storm? Did you imagine she would somehow find her way to safety on her own? Did you consider the possibility that she might freeze to death before morning? The question struck home with devastating accuracy. Sarah could hear the sharp intake of breath from all three men as they were forced to confront the true nature of their actions. They had not simply played a cruel prank or delivered an unwanted burden to someone else's doorstep. They had effectively signed her death warrant, abandoning her in conditions that would have killed her within hours. We thought you'd take her in, Kevin said, his voice barely above a whisper. We thought you'd give her shelter, maybe send her on her way in the morning. You thought I'd clean up your mess, Michael corrected. You thought you could dump your problem on me and walk away with clean consciences, never having to face the consequences of your cruelty. The wind outside reached a new level of fury, howling through the mountains like a living thing in pain. Sarah could hear objects striking the cabin walls, debris picked up by the storm and hurled with tremendous force. The temperature in the room was dropping rapidly as cold air poured through the damaged door and the hole torn in the wall by the falling tree branch. This storm is getting worse, Matthew said, his voice tight with pain and growing desperation. We need to get off this mountain before it kills us all. We, Michael said, pressing the blade a fraction deeper. There is no we in this situation. You came here uninvited, broke into my home, and threatened someone under my protection. The storm is the least of your problems. Sarah heard the sound of movement, subtle but unmistakable, as Alan shifted his position behind Michael. The gun was still trained on the hermit's back, but she could sense the younger man's growing uncertainty, his recognition that the situation had spiraled far beyond his ability to control. Just let us take the girl and go, Alan pleaded, his voice cracking with strain. We'll leave you alone, never bother you again. Nobody has to die here. Take the girl, Michael repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. Take her where exactly? Back to a town that has already decided she's too dangerous to live among decent people? To face whatever punishment you've decided she deserves for the crime of being born different? The question exposed the fundamental flaw in their position. They had no plan beyond the immediate gratification of their cruelty, no thought for what would happen to Sarah once they had her in their power. The realization seemed to hit all three men simultaneously, and Sarah could hear the shuffle of feet as they processed the implications. That's not your concern, Matthew said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. What happens to her after we leave is between her and the community. The community, Michael said, and there was infinite contempt in his voice. The same community that allowed Carol Hughes to frame an innocent woman for assault. The same community that turned a blind eye to your theft and deception. The same community that considers vigilante justice acceptable as long as the victims are sufficiently powerless. Sarah felt something shift in the atmosphere of the room, a subtle change that spoke of decisions being made and lines being crossed. The standoff had reached a critical point where words would no longer be sufficient to resolve the conflict. I'm done talking, Michael said, his voice carrying a finality that made Sarah's blood run cold. You have 10 seconds to drop your weapons and leave my property. After that, I start killing people. The countdown began in silence, marked only by the sound of heavy breathing and the storm raging outside. Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting for the explosion of violence that seemed inevitable. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them, the terrible knowledge that lives were about to be lost and nothing would ever be the same. 10, Michael said, his voice steady and implacable. Sarah heard the sharp intake of breath from the three intruders, heard the subtle shift of weight as they prepared for whatever was coming. 9. The blade pressed deeper into Matthew's throat, drawing a thin line of blood that Sarah could hear dripping onto the floor. 8. Alan's breathing became rapid and shallow, the harsh panting of a man on the edge of panic. 7. Kevin made a small whimpering sound, the kind of noise that escaped from people who suddenly realized they were about to die. 6. The storm outside reached a crescendo of fury, wind and rain lashing the cabin with tremendous force. 5. Matthew tried to speak, but only managed a strangled gasp as the blade cut off his words. 4. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, drowning out almost every other sound. 3. The gun behind Michael wavered, Alan's hands shaking as he struggled to maintain his aim. 2. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity as the moment of truth approached. 1 May. The word hung in the air like a death sentence, final and irrevocable, as 4 people balanced on the knife edge between life and death, waiting to see who would blink first and what terrible price would be paid for this night's work. The silence shattered like glass against stone as Alan's nerve finally broke. The gun clattered to the floor, his trembling hands unable to maintain their grip on the weapon that had promised salvation, but delivered only the weight of potential murder. The sound echoed through the cabin like a death knell, followed by Kevin's sob of relief and Matthew's strangled gasp as the blade at his throat pressed deeper in response to the sudden movement. "Smart choice," Michael said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a predator whose prey had finally acknowledged the futility of resistance. "Now kick it away from you, slowly." The metallic scrape of the gun sliding across wooden planks was followed by the sound of Alan collapsing to his knees, his body finally succumbing to the terror that had been building since they first entered the cabin. Kevin remained frozen near the ruined door, his face pale as moonlight, while Matthew continued to stand rigid as a statue with Michael's blade drawing a thin line of crimson across his throat. "Please," Matthew whispered, the word barely audible above the storm that continued to rage outside. "Please don't kill me. I have a mother, a sister who depends on me." "The same mother you've been stealing from," Michael replied, his voice devoid of sympathy. "The same sister you've been lying to about your gambling debts and your arrangement with the cattle thieves. Tell me, Matthew, what exactly makes your life worth preserving?" Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them, the terrible balance between justice and mercy that hung on Michael's decision. She had listened to these men plan her humiliation and possible death, had felt their casual cruelty like physical blows. But now that the tables had turned, she found herself unable to take satisfaction in their terror. "He's not worth it," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade of its own. "None of them are worth the blood on your hands or the weight on your conscience." Michael's head turned slightly in her direction, though the blade never wavered from Matthew's throat. "They came here to destroy you," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine puzzlement. "They abandoned you to die in a storm, broke into my home, threatened both our lives. Why would you speak for mercy?" Sarah considered the question, searching her heart for an answer that made sense even to herself. These men had indeed done everything Michael accused them of, had shown her no compassion or consideration for her humanity. By any measure of justice, they deserved whatever fate awaited them. Yet something in her rebelled against the idea of blood being spilled in her name, even the blood of her enemies. "Because someone has to break the cycle," she said finally, the words coming from a place deeper than conscious thought. "Someone has to choose mercy over vengeance, compassion over cruelty. If we answer their darkness with more darkness, what separates us from them?" The silence that followed was broken only by the howling wind and the steady drip of rain through the damaged roof. Sarah could feel Michael's gaze on her, weighing her words against the scales of his own experience and judgment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been admiration. "You are either very wise or very foolish," he said. "I have not yet decided which. Perhaps both, Sarah replied, managing a small smile despite the circumstances. Wisdom and foolishness often look very similar from the outside. Michael made a sound that might have been laughter, quickly suppressed. The blade at Matthew's throat remained steady, but Sarah sensed a shift in the hermit's posture, a subtle relaxation that suggested the immediate threat of violence had passed. Very well, Michael said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would echo through all their lives. I will offer you the same choice I have given others who have found their way to my mountain. You can leave now, tonight, and take your chances with the storm and the treacherous path down to the valley. Or you can remain here until morning, accept my hospitality, and leave with the dawn. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to drowning men. Sarah could hear the sharp intake of breath from all three intruders as they processed the unexpected mercy being offered to them. Matthew's body sagged with relief, though the blade at his throat kept him from moving too suddenly. There is, however, a condition, Michael continued, his voice hardening again. If you choose to stay, you will spend the night listening to the story of what you have done, not just to Sarah Nelson, but to yourselves and your community. You will hear the truth about the incident that led to her exile, and you will understand the full scope of the cruelty you have participated in. Alan struggled to his feet, his legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. We'll listen, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. We'll listen to whatever you want to tell us. And when morning comes, Michael added, you will return to your town with that knowledge. You will tell the truth about what happened here, about what you learned, and about the choice you were given. You will not seek revenge. You will not spread lies about what transpired in this cabin, and you will leave both Sarah and myself in peace. Is this understood? Kevin nodded frantically, tears streaming down his young face. Yes, sir, we understand. We won't cause any more trouble, I swear. Michael's gaze shifted to Matthew, the blade still resting against the man's throat. And you, do you accept these terms, or would you prefer to take your chances with the mountain tonight? Matthew's voice was barely a whisper when he replied, I accept your terms. The blade withdrew slowly, leaving a thin line of blood that Matthew immediately pressed his hand against. He staggered backward, his legs nearly giving out as the full weight of his terror finally hit him. Michael moved away with fluid grace, positioning himself between the three men in Sarah's chair. Sit, he commanded, gesturing toward the floor near the fireplace. All of you, make yourselves as comfortable as you can, because this will be a long night. The three men arranged themselves on the wooden floor with the awkward care of people who knew they were still very much at the mercy of their host. Kevin hugged his knees to his chest, rocking slightly as he tried to process what had just occurred. Alan sat with his back against the wall, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. Matthew remained standing for a moment longer, his hands still pressed to his throat, before slowly lowering himself to the ground. Michael moved to the fireplace and added several logs to the flames, sending sparks dancing up the chimney and filling the room with renewed warmth. The light played across his features, revealing a face that was younger than Sarah had expected, though marked by lines that spoke of hard experience and carefully guarded secrets. Before we begin, Michael said, settling into a chair that faced both Sarah and their unwelcome guests, there are things you should understand about the woman you came here to terrorize. Sarah Nelson is not the helpless burden your community has convinced itself she represents. She is not the dangerous liability that Carol Hughes painted her to be. She is a woman of remarkable courage and resilience who has survived hardships that would have broken weaker souls. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected praise, unused to hearing herself described in such terms. For so long, she had accepted the community's assessment of her worth, had internalized their judgment that she was more trouble than she was worth. I don't understand, Kevin said, his voice still shaky from his earlier terror. If she's not dangerous, why did she attack Mrs. Hughes? Why did everyone in town say she had to go? Michael's smile was cold and sharp as a winter wind. An excellent question, young Kevin. The answer lies in understanding the true nature of Carol Hughes and the web of manipulation she has woven around your community for years. He rose from his chair and moved to a wooden cabinet that stood against the far wall, returning with a bottle of whiskey and several glasses. He poured drinks for himself and Sarah, then set the bottle on the floor within reach of their guests. Drink if you need it, he said. This story is not an easy one to hear, especially for those who have been living within Carol Hughes's carefully constructed lies. Matthew reached for the bottle with trembling hands, taking a long pull directly from the neck and before passing it to his companions. The alcohol seemed to steady his nerves somewhat, though his eyes remained fixed on Michael with the wariness of a man who had looked death in the face and lived to tell about it. Carol Hughes, Michael began, settling back into his chair, is a woman who has made an art form of destroying lives while maintaining the facade of respectability. She has been the invisible hand behind dozens of personal tragedies in your town, always careful to ensure that her involvement remains hidden while others bear the consequences of her actions. Sarah listened with growing fascination as Michael painted a picture of systematic cruelty that went far beyond anything she had imagined. According to his account, Carol Hughes had been responsible for the ruin of at least 3 marriages, the bankruptcy of 2 local businesses, and the exile of several families who had somehow earned her displeasure. "But how do you know all this?" Alan asked, his voice filled with genuine confusion. "You live up here, away from everyone. How could you possibly have such detailed knowledge of what goes on in town?" Michael's smile was enigmatic. "I have my sources. People talk, and not everyone in your community is blind to Carol Hughes' true nature. There are those who see through her manipulations, but lack the power or courage to oppose her directly. They find other ways to ensure that the truth is preserved, even if it cannot be immediately acted upon." He took a sip of his whiskey, his eyes growing distant as he recalled information gathered over years of careful observation and patient investigation. "The incident at the church social was not an accident," he continued. "Carol Hughes had been planning Sarah's downfall for months, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. When the social presented itself, she saw her chance and took it." Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her heart racing as she prepared to hear the truth about the event that had destroyed her life. "What really happened that night?" Michael's gaze softened as it fell on her, and for a moment the hardness left his features entirely. "You were set up, Sarah. Carol Hughes arranged for a chair to be moved into your path at the precise moment you would be carrying the tray of glasses. She had studied your routine, knew exactly where you would walk and when. The collision was inevitable." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the full scope of the betrayal she had suffered. She had blamed herself for clumsiness, had accepted the community's judgment that her blindness made her inherently dangerous. To learn that she had been deliberately sabotaged, that her exile had been orchestrated by someone she had never even spoken to, was almost too much to bear. "But why?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What did I ever do to her? I barely knew the woman." "You represented something she could not tolerate," Michael replied gently. "You were different, vulnerable, and yet you persisted in trying to contribute to the community despite the obstacles you faced. Your very existence was a rebuke to her worldview, a reminder that strength comes in many forms and that worth is not determined by conventional standards." Kevin made a choking sound, whether from the whiskey or the weight of what he was hearing. "You're saying she framed Sarah just because she didn't like having a blind person in town?" "I'm saying she framed Sarah because Sarah represented everything Carol Hughes fears most," Michael corrected. "Courage in the face of adversity, dignity in the face of rejection, the ability to find purpose and meaning despite circumstances that would defeat lesser souls." The storm outside was beginning to weaken, the howling wind dropping to a steady moan and the rain settling into a rhythmic patter against the windows. The fire crackled and hissed, sending shadows dancing across the walls as the night wore on. "There's more," Michael said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "The attack on Sarah was not Carol Hughes' first attempt to remove someone she considered undesirable from the community. 3 years ago, she orchestrated the downfall of William Wilson, the school teacher who dared to suggest that her son was not the brilliant scholar she claimed him to be." Sarah remembered William Wilson, a gentle man who had been accused of inappropriate conduct with one of his students and driven from town in disgrace. The scandal had rocked the community, but no one had ever questioned the veracity of the accusations. "Wilson was innocent," Michael continued. "The allegations against him were fabricated by Carol Hughes, and supported by testimony from her son, who was facing expulsion for academic dishonesty. Rather than accept that her child was a failure, she chose to destroy an innocent man's life and career. Alan was shaking his head in disbelief. That's impossible. The whole town believed the charges against Wilson. There were witnesses, testimony from multiple sources. There were lies, Michael corrected sharply. Carefully crafted lies supported by people who were either too frightened of Carol Hughes to contradict her or too invested in maintaining their own positions to risk challenging her version of events. The pattern that emerged from Michael's account was one of systematic manipulation and control, with Carol Hughes at the center of a web of fear and obligation that allowed her to shape the community's perceptions to suit her own purposes. Those who opposed her found themselves facing social ostracism, economic pressure, or worse. But why hasn't anyone stopped her? Matthew asked, his voice still hoarse from his earlier terror. If people know what she's doing, why haven't they spoken up? Michael's laugh was bitter and humorless. Because Carol Hughes is very careful about who she targets and how she destroys them. She chooses victims who are already vulnerable, people who lack the social connections or resources to fight back effectively. And she always ensures that her attacks appear to be motivated by legitimate concerns rather than personal malice. He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the storm-lashed landscape beyond. Your community has allowed itself to be ruled by fear, by the desire to avoid becoming Carol Hughes's next target. In doing so, you have become complicit in her crimes, willing participants in a system of cruelty that destroys innocent lives for the sake of maintaining an illusion of order and respectability. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and profound sadness as she listened to Michael's words. To learn that her exile had been orchestrated, that she was not responsible for the disaster that had destroyed her life, provided some measure of relief from the guilt she had carried. But the knowledge that her entire community had been living under the shadow of one woman's malice was almost too depressing to contemplate. What about Janet Davis? Sarah asked, thinking of the woman who had employed her at the bakery. Did she know the truth about what happened? Michael returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful. Janet Davis suspected, but she lacked the courage to act on her suspicions. She was caught between her genuine affection for you and her fear of what Carol Hughes might do to her business if she opposed the campaign to have you removed from town. The revelation stung, though Sarah realized she should not have been surprised. Janet had been kind to her in her way, but kindness had its limits when confronted with the prospect of financial ruin and social ostracism. So she sacrificed me to save herself, Sarah said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. She made a choice, Michael replied carefully. Not a noble choice, perhaps, but an understandable one, given the circumstances. Fear makes cowards of us all, and Carol Hughes has built her power on the cultivation of fear. Kevin had been silent for several minutes, staring into the fire with the expression of someone whose entire worldview was crumbling around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We helped her," he said, the words torn from his throat like a confession. "We helped destroy an innocent woman's life because we were too stupid to see what was really happening." "Yes," Michael agreed, his voice devoid of sympathy. "You did. The question now is what you intend to do with that knowledge." The night wore on as Michael continued his account, painting a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond Carol Hughes's personal vendetta against Sarah. He spoke of business deals influenced by blackmail, of marriages destroyed by carefully planted rumors, of families driven from their homes by campaigns of harassment disguised as moral outrage. With each revelation, the three men seemed to shrink further into themselves, the weight of their complicity becoming harder to bear. They had thought themselves clever, had taken pride in their role as enforcers of community standards. Now they were being forced to confront the reality that they had been nothing more than tools in the hands of a master manipulator. "The worst part," Michael said as dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the windows, "is that none of this was necessary. Your community could have been a place of genuine refuge and mutual support, a haven where people like Sarah could find acceptance and purpose despite their differences. Instead, you allowed it to become a kingdom ruled by fear and sustained by cruelty." Sarah had remained largely silent throughout Michael's account, absorbing the full scope of the betrayal she had suffered while trying to process the implications for her future. The knowledge that she was innocent of the charges that had led to her exile was liberating, but it also left her feeling strangely hollow. If she was not the burden she had believed herself to be, if her exile had been based on lies and manipulation, then what did that say about the years she had spent accepting that judgment? What happens now? She asked as the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate the storm clouds. Where do I go from here? Michael's gaze met hers across the room, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not expected to find. It was not pity or sympathy, but something deeper and more complex. It was recognition, the acknowledgement of one survivor by another. That depends, he said quietly, on what you want. You could return to the valley armed with the truth about what was done to you. You could demand justice, seek vindication, force your community to confront the lies they have been living. Or, he paused, leaving the alternative unspoken but clearly implied. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as she considered the possibility he was offering. The chance to build a new life free from the judgments and limitations that had defined her existence in the town below. Or I could stay here, she said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. You could stay here, Michael confirmed. It would not be an easy life. This mountain is harsh and unforgiving, and the isolation can be crushing for those not prepared for it. But it would be your life, lived on your own terms, free from the fear and cruelty that have shaped your existence thus far. The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge across a chasm, a connection between two souls who had found in each other something they had never expected to discover. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks as she contemplated the choice before her, the chance to finally escape the prison of other people's expectations and limitations. I would not be a burden, she asked, voicing the fear that had haunted her for so long. You would be a partner, Michael replied, his voice carrying a certainty that took her breath away. Someone who understands the value of solitude and the strength that comes from surviving in a world that has no place for people like us. Matthew cleared his throat, breaking the spell that had settled over the cabin. What about us? What are we supposed to do with all this information? Michael turned his attention to the three men, his expression hardening once again. You are going to return to your town and tell the truth. All of it. You are going to expose Carol Hughes for what she is and demand that justice be done for the lives she has destroyed. They'll never believe us, Alan protested. She has too much power, too many people afraid to oppose her. Then you will have to find a way to make them believe, Michael replied implacably. You participated in a great injustice, and now you have the opportunity to help correct it. What you do with that opportunity will determine whether you remain complicit in Carol Hughes's crimes or become part of the solution. The sun was fully above the horizon now, painting the mountain landscape in shades of gold and amber that seemed to wash away the darkness of the night before. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that looked cleaner and somehow more hopeful than it had in the depths of the tempest. Sarah stood at the window, her face turned toward the warmth of the morning light, and felt something she had not experienced in years. It was not happiness exactly, though happiness was part of it. It was a sense of possibility, the knowledge that her life was not over, but was instead about to begin in earnest. The path down the mountain is treacherous after a storm like that, Michael said, addressing the three men who were preparing to leave. Stay together, help each other, and do not try to take shortcuts. The mountain does not forgive carelessness. Matthew stood in the doorway, his hand still pressed to the thin cut on his throat. Why, May? He asked, his voice filled with genuine confusion. Why are you letting us live, after what we did, what we were planning to do? Why show us mercy? Michael considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because Sarah asked me to, he said simply. Because someone has to break the cycle of violence and cruelty that has poisoned your community. And because you still have the chance to do something worthwhile with the knowledge you have gained. Kevin stepped forward, his young face marked by the weight of what he had learned. We'll tell them, he promised. We'll make sure everyone knows the truth about what Carol Hughes has done. See that you do, Michael replied. And remember, if you fail in this task, if you allow fear or convenience to silence you, then you will have proven that you are no better than the woman who has been manipulating you all along. The three men filed out of the cabin, their departure marked by a subdued gravity that spoke of lives forever changed by the night's revelations. Sarah listened to their footsteps receding down the mountain path, carrying with them the burden of truth that would either redeem them or destroy them. "Do you think they'll actually do it?" she asked as the sound of their passage faded into the distance. "Do you think they'll have the courage to stand up to Carol Hughes?" Michael moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I think they will try," he said. "Whether they succeed or not depends on factors beyond our control, but at least now they have the choice to do the right thing, which is more than they had before." Sarah nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. They had done what they could to set the wheels of justice in motion. The rest would have to unfold according to its own logic. "And what about us?" she asked, turning to face him, though she could not see his expression. "What happens now?" Michael's hand found hers, his calloused finger intertwining with her smaller ones in a gesture that spoke of partnership and mutual respect rather than pity or condescension. "Now we begin," he said simply. "We build a life together, here on this mountain, free from the judgments and limitations that have defined us both." Sarah felt a smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile she could remember experiencing in months. "I don't even know your real story," she said. "I know the rumors and legends, but I don't know who you really are or what brought you to this mountain." "There will be time for stories," Michael replied, his voice warm with promise. "We have all the time in the world to learn about each other, to discover what we can build together in this place that the world has forgotten." The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last remnants of the storm clouds and revealing a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. Sarah stood at the window of her new home, her hand clasped in that of the man who had become her unlikely savior, and felt the weight of her old life finally lifting from her shoulders. She thought of the town below, of the people who had judged her and found her wanting, and realized that their opinions no longer mattered. She had found something here on this mountain that she had never expected to discover: acceptance, partnership, and the chance to define herself on her own terms rather than by the limitations others had imposed upon her. "I'm ready," she said, her voice strong and clear in the morning light. "I'm ready to begin." Michael squeezed her hand gently, a gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. Together they turned away from the window and began the process of building a new life, one that would be shaped by their own choices rather than the fears and prejudices of others. The mountains stretched around them, vast and wild and full of possibility, a sanctuary where two souls who had been rejected by the world below could find the peace and purpose that had been denied them elsewhere. It would not be an easy life, but it would be their life, and that made all the difference. 3 months later, the first snows of winter were beginning to dust the peaks when Sarah heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin. She was in the garden behind the house, harvesting the last of the root vegetables that would see them through the cold months ahead, when the distant sound of hoofbeats reached her ears. Michael appeared beside her with the silent grace that had become familiar, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder in a gesture of reassurance. "3 riders," he said quietly, moving slowly, calling out as they approach. Not the behavior of people who mean harm. Sarah straightened, brushing dirt from her hands as she considered the possibilities. They had heard nothing from the valley below since the morning Matthew and his companions had departed, carrying with them the burden of truth about Carol Hughes and her manipulations. Part of her had wondered if they would find the courage to act on what they had learned, or if fear would ultimately silence them, as it had silenced so many others. "Should we go inside?" she asked, though she felt no real fear. The months she had spent on the mountain had changed her in ways she was still discovering, building confidence and strength she had never known she possessed. "No," Michael replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty that had become one of his most reassuring qualities. "Let us see what news they bring from the world below." The riders came into view as they crested the final ridge before the cabin, 3 figures on horseback, moving with the careful deliberation of people navigating unfamiliar terrain. As they drew closer, Sarah recognized the voice that called out in greeting, and her heart skipped a beat. "Janet Davis," she whispered, hardly able to believe her ears. The woman who had once employed her at the bakery dismounted near the cabin door, followed by 2 men Sarah did not immediately recognize. Janet's face was thinner than Sarah remembered, marked by lines of stress and worry that spoke of difficult months in the valley below. "Sarah," Janet said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Oh, my dear girl, I am so sorry. I am so very sorry for what we allowed to happen to you." Sarah felt Michael's hand tighten slightly on her shoulder, a silent reminder that she was no longer the vulnerable woman who had been cast out of town months before. She was stronger now, more sure of herself and her place in the world. "Janet," she replied, her voice steady and calm, "what brings you to the mountain?" The older woman's face crumpled with shame and regret. "We came to ask your forgiveness," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We came to tell you that the truth has finally come out, that Carol Hughes has been exposed for what she really is." One of the men stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. Sarah recognized him now as Diane Johnson's husband, a quiet man who had always seemed uncomfortable with the more vindictive aspects of community life. "Miss Nelson," he said formally, "my name is Thomas Johnson. I serve on the town council, and I have been authorized to extend the community's formal apology for the grave injustice that was done to you." Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions at his words. There was satisfaction in knowing that the truth had finally emerged, that her innocence had been established and her reputation restored. But there was also a strange detachment, as if the approval of people who had once rejected her no longer carried the weight it once had. "What happened?" Michael asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers to direct questions. Thomas Johnson cleared his throat nervously. Matthew Ramirez and his companions returned from their visit here with quite a story to tell. At first, few people believed them. The accusations they made against Carol Hughes seemed too extreme, too calculated to be credible. But then other people began to come forward, Janet added, her voice gaining strength as she continued. People who had suspected the truth for years, but had been too frightened to speak. William Wilson returned from his exile with documentation that proved his innocence. Families who had been driven from town began sharing their stories. The third member of their party, a younger man Sarah did not recognize, stepped forward with obvious nervousness. "The evidence became overwhelming," he said. "Carol Hughes was arrested 2 weeks ago on charges of fraud, blackmail, and conspiracy. She is currently awaiting trial in the county seat." Sarah absorbed this information with a sense of closure she had not expected to feel. Justice had finally been served, though it had taken far longer than it should have. The woman who had orchestrated her exile and the destruction of so many other lives would finally face the consequences of her actions. "The town council has voted to formally clear your name," Thomas Johnson continued. "All charges and accusations against you have been withdrawn, and your reputation has been fully restored. We would like to offer you compensation for the hardship you have endured, and we extend an invitation for you to return to the community whenever you choose to do so." The offer hung in the mountain air like an echo from another life, a connection to a world Sarah had once desperately wanted to rejoin. She felt Michael's eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this unexpected opportunity for vindication and return. "I appreciate your offer," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying a dignity and strength that surprised even her. "I am grateful to know that the truth has finally emerged and that justice is being served. But I will not be returning to the valley." Janet's face fell with disappointment and confusion. "But Sarah, you've been cleared of all wrongdoing. You can come home now, take your rightful place in the community. Things will be different this time, I promise." Sarah smiled, an expression of genuine warmth and contentment that transformed her features. "I am home," she said simply. "I have found my place here, with someone who accepted me when I had nothing to offer but my presence. I have discovered strength I never knew I possessed, and peace I never thought I would find." She felt Michael's hand move from her shoulder to take her hand, a gesture of solidarity and support that spoke volumes about the partnership they had built together. "This mountain has given me something your town never could," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It has given me the chance to define myself by my own standards rather than by the limitations others impose. I am not the helpless burden you once believed me to be. nor am I the dangerous liability Carol Hughes painted me as. I am simply Sarah Nelson, and for the first time in my life, that is enough. Thomas Johnson shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with her response. But surely you cannot mean to spend your life in such isolation, he said. What kind of future can you have here? Cut off from civilization? From the company of decent people? Michael's laugh was low and rich with genuine amusement. Decent people, he repeated, investing the words with layers of irony. You mean the same decent people who allowed an innocent woman to be framed and exiled? The same decent people who turned a blind eye to years of systematic cruelty and manipulation? Forgive me if I question your definition of decency. Janet flinched as if she had been struck, the truth of his words hitting home with devastating accuracy. We were wrong, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. We were terribly, shamefully wrong. But we want to make amends, to show Sarah that we have learned from our mistakes. You can make amends, Sarah replied gently, by ensuring that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. By being vigilant against the kind of manipulation and cruelty that Carol Hughes represented. By choosing courage over convenience when faced with injustice. She paused, considering her words carefully before continuing. But you cannot make amends to me by asking me to return to a place where I was never truly welcome. I have found something here that I never had in your town. Unconditional acceptance, genuine partnership, and the freedom to be myself without apology or explanation. The three visitors exchanged glances, clearly struggling to understand how someone could choose isolation over the opportunity to rejoin civilized society. Their confusion was understandable, Sarah realized. They had spent their lives believing that community acceptance was the highest good, that belonging to the group was worth almost any sacrifice of individual dignity or autonomy. What will you do here? Thomas Johnson asked, his voice filled with genuine puzzlement. How will you survive, so far from everything you have ever known? Sarah felt Michael's hand squeeze hers gently, a silent reminder of the strength they had built together over the past months. We will live, she said simply. We will tend our garden, preserve our food for winter, repair our cabin when storms damage it. We will read books by the fire, tell each other stories, find joy in simple pleasures that require no audience or approval. And when winter comes, Janet asked, her voice tight with concern, when the snows block the passes and you are truly alone up here? Then we will be alone together, Michael replied, speaking for the first time since the formal apologies had begun. We will share the work in the hardships, the small victories in the quiet moments of contentment. We will build something that belongs to us alone, something that cannot be taken away by the whims of people who have never bothered to understand us. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at his words, not tears of sadness, but of gratitude for the life they were building together. It was not the life she had once imagined for herself, but it was better than anything she had dared to hope for during those dark months when the world seemed determined to crush her spirit. I understand your concern, she said to Janet, her voice warm with genuine affection for the woman who had tried, in her limited way, to help. You feel responsible for what happened to me, and you want to ease your conscience by bringing me back to the fold. But my exile was not the tragedy you believe it to be. It was the beginning of my real life. The conversation continued for another hour, with the three visitors making increasingly desperate attempts to convince Sarah to reconsider her decision. They offered her a house in town, a position at the school, even a formal role in the town council as a way of acknowledging the injustice she had suffered. With each offer, Sarah felt more certain that she had made the right choice. These people meant well, but they still saw her primarily as a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed with appropriate charity and consideration. They could not conceive of her as a complete person capable of making her own decisions and living with the consequences. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, the visitors finally accepted that their mission had failed. They mounted their horses with obvious reluctance, looking back at Sarah and Michael with expressions of confusion and concern. If you ever change your mind, Janet called out as they prepared to leave, you will always have a place with us. Always. Sarah waved goodbye, watching until the three riders disappeared over the ridge that led back to the valley below. When they were gone, She turned to Michael with a smile that held no trace of regret or second-guessing. "Do you think we made the right choice?" she asked, though she already knew the answer in her heart. Michael's arm encircled her waist, drawing her close as they stood together in the gathering twilight. "I think we made the only choice that honored who we really are," he replied. "They offered you a place in their world, but it would have been the same place you occupied before, defined by their limitations and expectations. Here, you can be whoever you choose to become." Sarah leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. The mountains stretched around them in all directions, vast and wild and beautiful, a kingdom where they ruled as equals and partners. "Tell me a story," she said, as she did most evenings when the day's work was done and they sat together by the fire. "What kind of story?" Michael asked, his voice carrying the gentle humor that had become one of her favorite sounds in the world. "A story about two people who found each other in the most unlikely place," Sarah replied. "A story about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can turn out to be the best thing that ever happened." Michael's laugh rumbled through his chest, vibrating against her ear where it rested against his shoulder. "Once upon a time," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller, "there was a woman who was told she was too broken to belong anywhere and a man who was told he was too dangerous to be trusted. They met in a place the world had forgotten and discovered that sometimes the people the world rejects are exactly the people who can save each other." Sarah smiled, closing her eyes and letting his voice wash over her as he continued the story of their unlikely partnership. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and the mountains settled into the peaceful quiet of evening. She thought of the town below, where people were probably discussing her decision and shaking their heads at her foolishness. They would never understand how someone could choose isolation over inclusion, how someone could find freedom in exile rather than captivity in acceptance. But their understanding was no longer necessary or desired. She had found her place in the world, not despite her blindness, but because of everything she had learned from navigating a world that saw her as less than whole. She had discovered that wholeness came from within, from the courage to define oneself rather than accepting the definitions imposed by others. As Michael's story continued, weaving together themes of rejection and acceptance, of exile and homecoming, Sarah felt the last vestiges of her old life finally slip away. She was no longer the woman who had been abandoned at a stranger's door as a cruel joke. She was no longer the burden who had accepted the community's judgment of her worth. She was Sarah Nelson, partner and equal, loved and loving, home at last in a place where she could be herself without apology or explanation. The mountain wind whispered through the pines around their cabin, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of years they would spend together building something beautiful and lasting in this forgotten corner of the world. And as the stars whinnied overhead in their eternal dance, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. The joke, as it turned out, was on those who had tried to destroy her. In seeking to cast her out, they had given her exactly what she needed most: the chance to discover who she really was and the opportunity to build a life worthy of that discovery. The mountain had claimed her, but she had claimed it in return. And in that mutual claiming, she had found something more precious than all the acceptance and approval in the world. She had found herself, and she had found home.